54,000. That is the number of people from Los Angeles who, when faced with the threat of gentrification in 2013, were displaced from their homes with a simple reason that someone a little bit richer than them wanted to live closer to work. This is what Team Hong Kong stands against. What is our stance? We're willing to trade off potential slight improvements that the speed and scale of gentrification can bring, for the simple reason that the original residents of these communities not only don't reap these benefits, but get actively and massively harmed. Under our world, we opt to prefer giving these communities and neighborhoods a chance to develop naturally. Sure, it may not always happen, but we think people should have a chance, and this chance is what gentrification removes. With that, some definitions. What is gentrification? It's the process by which neighborhoods are upgraded as richer residents gradually move in, resulting in the partial or near complete displacement of original residents. What separates it from typical development is the speed and magnitude by which it happens. We're happy to propose a variety of policies which we leave up to local governments to decide to implement in order to actively prevent gentrification. Things like rent control and caps on rent, property and land tax, if appropriate, reinvesting the money from these taxes into building things that actively stop gentrification, like council housing in the UK, as well as actively easing restrictions on building housing in richer neighborhoods. With that, 3 arguments from me. 1, some quick characterization on gentrification. 2, the economic harms to local residents. Finally, harms towards communities. Firstly, how does gentrification look like? It's important to note the neighborhoods we're talking about tend to be inner city, working class neighborhoods where residents have lower income. The residents inside of these regions tend to have similar religions, ethnicities, and income. It's important to note these places are not havens of hopelessness, drug, and crime, for the simple reason that no people want to move into these regions. If this were the case, developers and businesses won't think their investments are secure if they were to intend to develop these regions. The people that move into these areas are disproportionately white upper middle class college graduates who move into these neighborhoods either because of convenience, as in they want to live closer towards their employment places, as well as believe these places have the potential to be developed in the future. Thus, when these people move into these regions, they begin to do things like demand goods and services that directly cater towards their purchasing power and interests, as well as considering how they have substantial amounts of private capital, firms automatically come in to cater towards this demand. With that, economic harms of gentrification. Cost of living inside of these neighborhoods rises for 3 reasons. 1, as there is now a new wave of migrants who have disproportionately higher income compared to original residents, they're able to do things like demand better and nicer housing on a larger scale. Rents directly increases as a result. Old flats inside of these regions get converted into luxury apartments, and landlords now have a larger price incentive to price gouge and force original tenants out so that wealthier tenants can move in. This is why people in Los Angeles had to pay up to 67% of their original income when gentrification was ongoing. Secondly, local businesses inside of these regions oftentimes can't deal with the higher cost of production that results from rents increasing on this scale. So oftentimes local businesses are forced to close down, leaving both employer and employee unemployed. So for example, if a local marketplace or grocery store closes down, Marks & Spencer's moves in to fill the such demand and sell goods and services at a higher price. Finally, considering how more people are going to be unemployed after gentrification, these people oftentimes, even if they try to seek better employment, oftentimes don't get it, for the simple reason that the people inside of these regions oftentimes have no skill and no tertiary education, as well as the incentive for new businesses to pay the large labor force who are willing and able to work cheap, no substantial increases in wages. With that, 3 impacts. Firstly, as cost of living directly increases, the amount of disposable income people inside of these regions have decreases. Families are now made to have to make tough choices, like eating 2 meals a day instead of 3, as well as having your kids work part-time jobs rather than spend time at home doing homework. Secondly, even if you try to stay inside of your neighborhood, but you're unable to live in the house or apartment you previously rented, families are now going to do things like live in entire rooms, entire families forced into single rooms, or in the case of Oakland, California, if you really want to stay in your own neighborhood, you're going to do things like live in parks, creating mass homelessness, which we on proposition can avoid. Finally, for the people who really do live paycheck to paycheck, they're going to move into the worst of the worst neighborhoods, considering how gentrification is oftentimes ongoing in multiple regions at the time. These are places with no economic opportunities that these people want to grab. They don't feel a connection towards these neighborhoods, as well as these neighborhoods like inner city Milwaukee have statistically higher rates of drugs and crimes. We force original residents out into places where their lives get substantially worse. I'll take a POI.
Okay, you said that when corner shops close and Marks & Spencer moves in, no one can get a job, but why can't people go and work in Marks & Spencer?
Look, I've shown you reasons why even if you try to work in Marks & Spencer's, you maybe get paid an additional $1 per hour, but this isn't able to cover things like the price of goods and services and your costs of rent, dramatically escalating over large periods of time. Moving into community harms. Why do community harms appear? Considering how the people we're talking about, upper middle class residents moving into these regions, they have things like donations, they have things like local government connections, and they have political will that they're able to direct to force both governments and private firms into doing things that directly cater towards their needs and interests, which are not only useless, but actively harmful towards the original residents inside of their communities. Take the example of education. We see wealthier families, when they move into these regions, trying to do things like have local governments redirect funding from all schools into the schools that they're going to send their kids to. Doing things like, as well, changing curriculum and forcing local governments to change curriculum in a way where they decrease things like English as a second language classes in exchange for doing things like funding school orchestras, which only directly cater towards the needs of wealthier tenants the most. Finally, even doing things like increasing the amount of tasks that require internet, which up to 70% of low-income kids don't require, the educational outcome towards original tenants get reduced. The worst of the worst scenarios we're talking about is the Taki school in Istanbul, where schools have an active incentive to search for the home addresses of certain children in order to try to deny them places at the school if they think they come from a lower background and they don't have the resources to succeed. So we may get superficially better changes, like a larger school orchestra, but the educational outcomes of these kids get actively harmed. Secondly, in regards to policing, when richer tenants move into these regions, they see original residents as a threat towards their nicer homes, towards the assets that they bring with them. They begin to do things like lobby for a stance that is tough on crime. Things like increased amounts of stop and frisk, increased amounts of racial profiling by police. This is why in the Bronx, when gentrification was ongoing, we saw a 235% increase in the amount of vagrancy and loitering reports. The harm of this to original residents is this. A lot of people are now going to get unjustified criminal records, which directly hurts their ability to find meaningful job prospects in future. No, thank you. As well, escalation and tensions begin to increase. When original residents now see the people moving into their communities as an active threat, as an invasion, the chance of any meaningful integration becomes lessened under their side. Finally, in regards to community ties, it's important not to undervalue how important community is to a lot of these original residents. If you are an immigrant who's moving to the United States for a first time, if you are a refugee, if you're an ethnic or religious minority, for a Muslim to be able to have easy access towards a mosque and not feel strange and not feel discriminated every time they go to pray, this is something that's increasingly important towards them. To be able to have cultural familiarity and people who speak the same language as you, not only offering you jobs, but local government services who are able to connect with you on that level, to respect you as a person and respect your qualifications. This is important to a lot of people. The comparative that Estonia has to defend is this. When your place of worship gets knocked down and bulldozed in exchange for having a Starbucks or Marks and Spencer's built on top of it, if you're now not only able to live inside of a neighborhood where you feel welcomed, but rather forced into places where you are a minority, where you may feel unsafe and may feel discriminated against. We think every human being deserves this amount of respect. Every human being deserves a place to feel responsible and feel welcome. We in Hong Kong are so proud to propose.
Thank you, PM, for his lovely speech. Now call upon the first member of the opposition team, Anarchy Mikolosar.
Before gentrification, these areas are places where residents suffer under crime, poor education, and low quality employment. These areas are neglected by the state currently as it has no capital to fix them. Gentrification engages private capital in order to increase the living quality and safety to all residents. Against these problems, clearly we support some regulation that moderates the effects of gentrification but doesn't actively prevent it, such as developers needing to also contribute to community by building community parks or schools or requiring a percentage of affordable housing. But gentrification itself is a necessary and urgent process, as we will prove to you in our case. But before that, let's look at what side proposition brought into this debate. So firstly, notice that the core of their case is that people are going to be displaced. The first response to that is that gentrification, yes, allows the influx of new residents of all kinds, but it does not necessarily mean the previous ones will be displaced. Because simply, as multiple story apartment complexes are built instead of empty lots and low density residences, there is now going to be high population density that allows simply more people to live there, and together with poor people. This is the reason why, according to a US study, a household being displaced in a gentrified neighborhood in the US was a mere 1.3%. No thank you. Furthermore, another study of overall US cities proved that gentrifying neighborhoods, people moved only 0.5% more likely than from non-gentrifying neighborhoods, meaning new residents don't necessarily cause displacement as site proposition wants to characterize. But notice that another reason why gentrification does not make people move as rapidly is that with higher rent prices, with gentrification you will also have higher incomes and better employment opportunities, which means that you will probably afford the living there. So gentrification does not always mean displacement or moving, and the majority will stay and enjoy the benefits and the developments that gentrification brings. But even if, under their case, some people might have to move away and move, then firstly, a large group of them are homeowners whose property values rise. That means that they will get so much more profit out of their homes, which means that they can be risen from lower middle class to middle class, for example. Side proposition is preventing these benefits to these poor residents. But even if there is a small group who don't have any property, they will probably move to a similarly priced neighborhood. Living quality is quite the same, and it just doesn't mean that all other areas except for the gentrifying one are horrible for them. Moving is quite natural. Then they say that natural development will occur in these places. Notice that this is a contradiction, as they say that these people are so vulnerable that they simply can't manage any small rent change or can't manage moving, right? But at the same time they say that they have the capital to make massive benefits and improvements in these areas, renovating their homes, probably fixing all of the roads that will happen under our place. This is a contradiction. Those developments won't happen because these people are so vulnerable as they claim. Now moving on to our case. How gentrification firstly positively improves the locals' living standards inside of the gentrifying neighborhood, and then notice that we will prove to you how it improves the living standards outside gentrifying neighborhoods in the whole city as well. So firstly, employment and income growth increases for the locals in gentrifying areas. Gentrification by definition sees that many businesses will move into these areas, and crucially, they need a vast array of workers because there is a huge demand for a service sector. Crucially, this means that their point about these people being jobless because corner shops are going out of business. Sure, corner shops might go out of business, but these better companies have much higher employment and income opportunities. Why? Larger companies have a chain of management that creates career prospects from people, from clerk to senior clerk and far beyond. So even if firstly it increases only by $1, then they will have the opportunity to benefit and develop and climb up the chain. Gentrification also brings along a higher level of pay because companies are now able to pay higher wages than your local small businesses, even to the lowest level employees. The largest 2019 study examining 100 gentrifying neighborhoods around the world found a large increase in employment and income in all household categories. In public housing, the most vulnerable people, subsidized housing people, saw an annual increase of $3,000 in gentrifying areas. Therefore, gentrification improves the life quality of everyone, and clearly this is not as bad as they want to characterize. Moreover, jobs in corporations are much more likely to be beneficial in the long term, as they don't operate outside of your state's tax rate, which means that they contribute to your pension schemes and your healthcare as well more than local corner shop or poor small businesses, right? Public services also are going to improve. Real estate developers improve this area with their funds because they want to make it attractive to their clients, right? So that the benefits of their developments will spill over to all of these residents in the city. Deutsche Wohnen, the largest real estate developer in Germany, built public parks and renovated roads in Kreuzberg, Berlin. Notice this is not something that their vulnerable groups could do by themselves, as they claim by natural development. In Chicago, Englewood's public school was built by developers on private capital for everyone. Furthermore, wealthier individuals with better job positions are much more likely to influence the local governments to benefit education and safety, as they claim. They say that, well, they're going to lobby for better English classes that the poor residents don't necessarily need. No, this is particularly what we want. We want these developments, we want these people to have a better English language skills so that they can compete with the general population. They are going to have better teachers, better education, more English language classes, and this is necessary in order to survive in the US environment that they characterize. Furthermore, wealthier people have more time, resources, and know-how to help their children with their studies and will stress the importance of education. And those aspirations of going to university, for example, are going to spill over to the classroom to also another kind of like previous resident children, which means everybody will benefit. Safety, no thank you. They brought up the Bronx had tensions where there was police brutality. This is a very rare case. We don't have to protect police brutality in every case. But even if at first it will be a great change and there will be probably more policing, then it's worth in the long term as people won't get mocked in the streets or get murdered as the overall like neighborhood is better, right? And it is unfair to stop people from having a better life quality simply because some people will move away. With this argument, we prove too that people will have a better living condition. But why we help the city residents outside the gentrified neighborhoods? Firstly, that the state has now more resources to develop underdeveloped areas that are not gentrifying neighborhoods, because governments don't have the funds to build up all the deteriorated neighborhoods in the region, right? But gentrification is an opportunity to engage private capital in order so that states can use their resources to build up those areas that are the poorest in the city, which side proposition completely ignores as they deal with only the gentrifying neighborhoods. So now states can improve other areas and therefore more people will benefit in the city overall, and we manage to win by the scale. But secondly, the supply of housing opportunities with gentrification increases. This means that property prices are going to be lowered in the whole city because there is for the same demand, there is simply more supply of housing. Notice that side proposition won't stop the rapid urbanization and the demand. Rather, their like zoning laws, rent control, and all restrictions are going to increase the property prices in the whole city. Why? Because there is simply less supply for the growing demand, right? San Francisco is notoriously high property prices. It had the same mechanisms that side proposition wants to do. So we prove to you that gentrification crucially builds up deteriorating neighborhoods and improves the lives, but secondly, that we protect a larger scale of people in the whole city by not increasing rent prices and displacing the poor people elsewhere in non-gentrifying areas. For those reasons, opposed.
Thank you, Elo, for her eloquent remarks, and now call up GPM on the proposition.
Opposition tries to tell you that gentrification is, to quote them, urgent and necessary. This is not the case at all. We on side proposition believe that gentrification is oftentimes forced artificially by the governments that they say are going to be able to better provide public services on their side of the house. It is done in order to protect the rich and to protect them from the free market and to let the poor suffer as a result. So before moving into my substantive on today's debate on why we think that we actually improve local government incentives on our side of the house, let's take a look at exactly what's been happening in the big clash of this debate. First off, they tried to tell us that these neighborhoods are fundamentally broken, that there is huge amounts of crime, that there are murders happening everywhere. We think that this is simply not the case. As our P1 told you, these neighborhoods are not going to be that terribly broken down, simply for the fact that if they are so terrible, middle class people won't consent to actually living there. They'll be too scared of the crime, they'll be too scared of that type of lack of development. And moreover, it is so much harder to develop those areas, they're much more likely to go to areas that are lower income but not completely broken. On top of that, we think that oftentimes the neighborhoods that are most likely to gentrify are ones that have close proximity to other wealthy neighborhoods, which is why wealthier people want to move into them so they can be close to like other city hotspots. We think that in those cases, it is very, very unlikely that you are going to be that you're going to be as broken and as distant from like basic policing and basic standards of living that they say that they are. So as a result, we don't think that these cases are as urgent and necessary as they tell us they are. But then let's also take a look at their stance. because they tell us that they're fine with doing things like requiring a certain percentage of affordable housing and requiring things like public services to be developed as well. We think that what this crucially means is that they also concede that it is fine to do things like prevent simply mass free market and mass whatever the developers want for the sake of people who need it more. The fact is, doing things like building affordable or public housing deters gentrification because that's capping the number of like more luxury houses that you can build. It also does things like people who live in public housing are often negatively associated with things like crime, etc. We think that as a result, if they concede that they're willing to prevent parts of gentrification for the sake of people who need it more, we think that that's a huge trade-off that they step into our world as well. But now let's take a look at exactly what happens in gentrification on two levels, in cases where do people actually get displaced and harmed, and cases in where they don't. Because they tell us that people won't really get displaced. They first off tried to basically throw examples at us without really analyzing it. And then they told us that the analysis for this was that it's because even if cost of living go up, because you have higher income and higher employment, it's really okay. The issue with this was that they don't conceive of exactly how that employment comes around. We think that oftentimes the bigger corporations come in, are able to do things like rely on automation so they don't actually need to hire as many people as they say they do. On top of that, they're able to very easily replace the people who come in and out because they have such a larger employment base to draw upon, and therefore small mistakes are more likely or easier to get you fired on their side of the house. On top of that, we think that a few dollars in the rise of your minimum wage really means nothing when the cost of your rent is doubling, tripling in a matter of years, when every grocery store around you suddenly means that just basic bills that you have to pay are suddenly doubling and tripling as well. $2 extra every hour is not going to do anything to solve that. But secondly, in the cases of people who actually do stay. Because we think that first off, we reject the idea that most of these people are homeowners. We think that most low-income people can't afford that. But on top of that, they tell us that it's fine if they tell us that in these cases, it's because the neighborhood is going to improve so much that it's perfectly fine with people staying here. The issue with this is that they completely ignored what Alan told you in his speech when he talked about how there are going to be all these micro policies. That means the side of opposition cannot simply say we'll just prevent things like bad policing. We think that the crucial thing to note is that preventing gentrification as a wide stance is very easy to regulate with things like zoning laws, etc. Things like how police treat individual members is something that's much harder to regulate. Things like the way teachers discriminate against lower income students is much harder to regulate. We think that they fail to realize that a lot of their benefits of their nicer neighborhood are simply inaccessible when the neighborhood gets away from the lower income people. Now moving into substantive on why we think we change local government incentives, so before that, appeal act.
Poor education, low safety for these vulnerable individuals exists anyway. How else do you solve any of these problems?
Okay, I'll jump right into that on why we think we improve local government on our side of the house. Because we think that gentrification destroys the mechanisms that usually push governments to improve things. These things look like voting, where on our side of the house we have unified voting blocks based on people having similar socioeconomic backgrounds, similar ethnicities and religions, etc. They all have very similar interests and are therefore able to push for the same things. On their side of the house, they fracture those people into the wealthier middle class, into homeowners from original residents, and into original residents who are renters. All those people are affected differently by gentrification and therefore have different desires. It is far more likely that those original renters will be outvoiced by the people who have far more political capital and are from the middle class. We think that they lose out on their side of the house. On top of that, the issue is with optics. When people complain to the government, our schools aren't good enough, for example, the government is able to say, hey, look, your neighborhood is gentrifying, it's getting so much better. Clearly, improvement is on the way, despite the fact that these improvements are not actually reaching the people who need them. They're simply able to gloss it over with superficial fixing. We think that the crucial thing that this means is that gentrification on their side of the house acts as a quick patch that removes the issues from the eyes of the wealthy, but doesn't actually fix the problem for the people who need it the most. They simply transplant issues or gloss over them. We think that as a result, it is far more likely on our side of the house that governments will have to catch the people that fall through the cracks. We think that even on their side of the house, if the areas do get better, there will always be people who don't get enough welfare, who don't get enough utilities and power going to their homes, who do fall through the cracks that they say are going to be papered over. We think that as a result, when governments are able to simply gloss over them, we think that they fail the people that they have a mandate to protect. But secondly, let's look at the pressures that normally cause gentrification and how governments respond. Because when they tell us that they're urgent and necessary, we don't actually think that that's the case. We think that oftentimes it actually stems from governments that are weak-willed and cater to the rich. What does that mean? It means that when wealthy people refuse to allow condominiums to be built in their neighborhoods, they want to do things like protect the exclusivity and value of their own property. That means that they push governments to do things like downzone, like the Upper East Side of New York, and upzone areas like Harlem, like Bloomberg did in 2003. This means that governments are able to do things like use zoning regulations and minimum and maximum apartment sizes to mean that the developers on their side of the house really have no choice but to go to these lower income neighborhoods. This crucially means that gentrification is not actually the way of development. It's actually the rich people insulating themselves from the forces of the free market and then letting the free market bulldoze over the people who need the most protection. We think that the state is not going to, we think that the state, when they tell us that the state is going to be able to improve so many other things, when we characterize the state as being catering to the rich and actually choking housing supply to protect the rich, we don't think that that's the case. We think that on our side of the house, when gentrification is no longer an easy option, we force governments to make hard decisions. We force them to upzone richer neighborhoods because to allow developers somewhere to go and have inclusionary zoning in those areas. We force governments to have things like better inner city planning so that if people can't simply gentrify areas to get easier commutes, they have to actually have better transport links through those areas. We think that crucially what this argument proves is that it is not our burden to guarantee fail-safe mechanisms that are always going to guarantee us the best neighborhoods on our side of the house. That is not why we prevent things. We prevent things to prevent harm, not to guarantee the best outcomes. What opposition side of the house does, however, is that they remove the chance for these poorer neighborhoods to benefit off of any advantages that they may have, like proximity to city hotspots, like Chinatown being next to Tribeca and Soho. We think that opposition denies them that breathing space and the chance for natural improvement and government help. They deny it for the case of wealthy opportunists and callous elitism, and for those reasons, we are so proud to propose.
I thank the DPM for their remarks and call upon the DLO, Marcus Laranja.
Jesse Abrams was a man living in Logan Circle who was able to sell a house that he bought for $130,000 at a price that was 13 times higher for $1.6 million. He was able to do that for the fact that his neighborhood gentrified and that the cost that he could ask for the house that he owned was so much greater. Side proposition would have locked Jesse in. They would have locked him in a situation of poverty. Jesse would never have been able to escape due to the fact that the real estate that he owned would never have gone up in price. We think that it's rude for them to do that and to deny the rights for people who are living in poverty to actually rise in social mobility and financial stability. In my speech, first, I have a few points of framework, what this debate is actually about and what we are protecting in this debate. Then a few points of rebuttal, when you're rebuilding, and then bring to my point about integration, where that's going to be so much better under our side. Firstly, the second speaker tries to tell you that we are also preventing gentrification. I can't believe in a world in which this is true. The main profit for all of these developers is always going to come from having housing for exactly those middle class and upper class people. And we think that that's fine. Their main profit margin arises from that. It's not going to be a huge financial burden for them to build a few stories of cheap housing as well with that. You're always going to still get a huge amount of profits from the people who are going to be moving into those areas, and therefore they're still going to be building a little bit of housing for the impoverished as well. That's fine. It's not going to force all of these people to displace. But let's look at the second claim that they make. They say that most or the majority or all of these people are going to be displaced. The first speaker starts off their speech by saying that 54,000 people were displaced in Los Angeles. I don't think that that's all of the poor people in that area, and it's probably not true that all of these people will be displaced. Let's have a clear look at their examples, and you can see that it's obviously not true. Then they say that all of these neighborhoods aren't quite that bad, and actually that they are fine. Firstly, we don't think that has to be true for the simple reason that people are moving into those areas. They constantly tell you that these areas are close to the centre, therefore obviously richer people will always want to move to those areas because it's closer to their jobs, they aren't alienated from the city centre. That's where their motivation comes from. But moreover, they obviously agree to the fact that people don't really feel safe in those areas once they have moved there. They see that white people reported people, and the rate of reporting increased by 235%. Therefore, people are obviously willing to accept the risk that they are moving into, but still want to go there even if they don't feel safe constantly and these neighborhoods aren't the best. But finally, even if we agree to the fact that these neighborhoods are kind of good, then they're all never going to be better under their side. They're better at the moment because developers want to make them better in order to get richer people moving in there. These landlords are not going to try to improve the housing that they currently own because they know that even if they can never actually raise the rents because of the rent control that they put on these people presumably would be capable of going along with the rent price increase because they themselves tell you that these communities are already getting better. Therefore, even if we take their best case, we're still winning there. Moving on to my point of rebuttal concerning these jobs. They tell you that Marks & Spencer is going to take these people's jobs away. I don't understand why this is going to be true. Marks & Spencer is exactly the company who's going to give jobs to this low-income population. The middle class and upper class people they talk about would never want to work in Marks & Spencer because they are highly educated, as they themselves tell you. This is true on a more general level as well. These people who are living in low-income people are working service jobs, and gentrification is always going to give an increase in these service jobs in those areas. They're going to have more opportunities of labor. But moreover, these opportunities of labor are going to be better for them. Firstly, because big companies can give them higher wages than any of these corner shops that they want to explain to. But secondly, these are going to be better opportunities because they can actually rise on a career ladder that was unable for them when working in a corner shop. Once working at Marks & Spencer can be a seller at first, then be a supervisor, then be a chief supervisor, and move on from that, then it's always going to increase their wages. This wouldn't be possible for those people in corner shops, and their financial status would always be hindered on their side. Then their point about people abusing political capital and ruining the services that these people get. These communities currently already lack political capital, and the proposition itself explains this very well to you when they say that these people rely on their communities. Therefore, presumably, their state isn't doing the best things for them if they have to rely on their communities and can't actually rely on state services. No, thank you. But moreover, the richer people will always have more, and they're therefore likely to increase the social services in those areas with their political capital. They also want better state schools, and they also want to send their kids to places with better education. Their point is quite narrow because I don't see how English as second language classes actually affect those rich people enough to make them want to get rid of all of those classes in that area. So it doesn't really affect those people, and therefore they won't have a problem with that. Comparatively, it's better under our side because people in gentrifying areas actually get the lower benefits, but also the state has more funds to actually help those who aren't going to have the problems that they want to describe to you. Finally, like points of rebuilding. They say that people are going to lose political power. This is the wrong assumption to make. This motion presumes that the state already wants to help people who are living in poverty. Therefore, if they make a point of it, the state not helping people in poverty, I don't understand why their motion would even be true, their side of the house can even be explained in this debate. But moreover, we must concede that they already have little political capital, because if gentrification truly is this bad, then people obviously have been unable of stopping this thing from happening and haven't had enough political capital. Our side fundamentally increases it, and you will never have more. Moreover, they never deal with our second argument, which tells you how the rent prices are increasing everywhere, and we're the one who increases supply, thus helping all of the poor people in these towns and not only in gentrifying areas. Their side leaves those poor people living elsewhere unnoticed, and actually doesn't help the fact that their rent prices are always going to be increasing. We increase the supply in our city, and therefore these people can actually get a job. Go.
If a luxury condominium that charges a certain price per square foot is built, existing residential areas also feel the need to raise prices in order to be competitive. How do original residents afford this?
They afford this because of the fact that they can get more wages at their workplace. They can afford this because of the fact that they still have housing to move into. But let's take your best case and say that they don't. Then under our side, they're still going to be better because they have other places to move and they have other places where the state can direct funds in order to make their living conditions better. You would not have those funds because you're not engaged in private interests and are leaving you yourselves a higher burden. Moving on to my point about integration. I think that they give you a point about communities, but never actually tell why these communities are going to disappear, because we still think that most people don't have to move. But even with moving, these communities don't disappear. People are moving constantly, but we still have these communities that they talk about. No, thank you. But moreover, we need to look at the practical impacts. Community is nice and all, but I think these people also want a chance of actually getting out of these communities. So let's look at integration. Pre-gentrified neighborhoods, as they explained to you, are already defined by ethnic lines. Gentrification gives us an opportunity to get rid of these ethnic lines. In Brooklyn, an otherwise black majority area undergoing gentrification, the white population grew by 40,000 and the Asian population by 75,000 people. This shows that through an increase in population density which gentrification brings, these neighborhoods also became more diverse. Having diverse neighborhoods is a prerequisite for tackling discrimination. The best way to tackle stereotypes is to eliminate misperceptions that stem from a lack of contact, which is always there aside from position themselves taken. Only personal contact disproves false stereotypes, as you have a nuanced and more humanizing view of at least one member of that community, causing apprehension towards the racist attitudes that you currently hold. A Princeton meta-study of over 500 papers found that larger contact between different groups is in clear correlation with a decrease in discrimination and negative stereotypes. This means that these people in those areas now have a higher chance of contact, and thus helping them access social mobility, for example, better jobs because they have more connections, have met these people in schools already, or now trying to integrate into a field that is very majority-based. This leads to a change in the general perception, which also affects people living outside of these gentrifying areas, having a spillover effect when that whole minority who otherwise would never be helped. Comparatively, they're pushing these people to live in enclaves, which fundamentally have worse living conditions, for example, less income. In the United States, Dominicans living in enclaves earn 50% less than their counterparts living elsewhere. Notably, these people themselves don't want to live there. 50% of UK Chinatowns, people say that they want to get out of these communities. Schemes are nice, but are helping those people practically. Gentrification allows these people to escape the things that they're currently locked in for these reasons happen to approach.
The fundamental problem with Team Estonia is that they confuse capacity with incentive. Sure, rich developers might be able to give money to the poor. They might be able to build more housing aimed at the low-income families in that neighborhood. They may be able to build public schools that cater for a broad spectrum of students. But crucially, they don't have an incentive to because it doesn't earn them money. For every school that you build that goes to a low-income family, that's a property that could have been built for a rich family that would have earned you loads of money. We think that for that reason, people aren't going to make the developments and the community-centered improvements that they are so fond of. 3 clashes to the house today. First of all, let me just get the extension out of the way. Second of all, on gentrification, improving or harming original residents. And finally, on which side has better economic development overall. So first, an idea of racial integration, right? So they tell us that mixing and interacting is always good for harmony and mutual understanding. Look, that may be true, but definitely not when it comes in the form of an invasion. You might not have a problem with white people to start with, but when they come in sweeping in, buying up homes, driving prices up, and transforming the neighborhood which was once built for you, your culture, your family, into something that's completely different, aimed at a totally different class, you alienate these people, you only inflame tension. There's a reason why people in Baltimore, people in St. Henry's went out on the streets and rioted when gentrification came in, as opposed to welcoming the newcomers in with open arms. But second of all, let's just, even if they are right about racial integration getting marginally better, we don't think this matters, because this debate is about gentrification, which is about short-term harm and shielding people from the excesses of the market. We think that even if they get marginally better racial integration in the long term, we think that's definitely not worth the short-term immediate harm done to families. And that leads on to my second clash, right? About whether gentrification is better or worse for original residents. We think that this is the most important issue in this debate, which is what we set up at P1, and we think that they agree with this because that's broadly what they spent their O1 talking about. So if they win this clash, I think we're likely to take this debate. So they give us three main ideas for this, right? Not now. First of all, on job opportunities and having higher income. Our first contention with this is that that's just not true, right? This is premised on the idea that the companies that come in are all huge, have long supply chains, and therefore have the ability to give, offer opportunities for promotion and so on and so forth, right? Our first contention is that no, the companies that come into these areas follow demand. So what that's likely to look like is like chain stores, small shops that replace the ones that have closed down in beforehand. It doesn't look like factories opening up, R&D firms opening up and welcoming loads of workers in. They offer fundamentally the same service. They therefore take roughly the same number of workers. But second of all, even if it's true, like Jenna already told you, that if you're the large firms that they want to talk about, they're likely to automate anyways, they're likely not to have such a high demand for workers, they never responded to this. But finally, a lot of their benefits are predicated on the idea that these people can now have higher quality jobs than they used to have. Like they can get into management positions. We just don't think that's true. Because if they characterize these people as poor to start with, we don't think, and if they were working at a mom-and-pop store that was closed after gentrification, they definitely don't have the qualifications to go into a high-powered, well-paying job. But second of all, we think that even if wages and employment rises, we think that their lives still get worse because costs rise at a rate which outpaces the increase in unemployment. Please stop. First of all, we told you that it's not just a small rise in income, as they told us, that it's not just a small rise in the cost of living, because one, like shops close, everything becomes more expensive, from your portable to your food to like sending your kid to school. But second of all, crucially, rent gets so much more expensive. We gave you the idea that rent rose to 67% of income. That's huge, ladies and gentlemen. Having our wages increase slightly just isn't enough to cover this. But third of all, their mechanism for why wages get higher is just not true, because they said that these bigger companies have the ability to give higher wages. They might have the ability to do so, but they certainly don't have the incentive to, because they have access to a pool of laborers that are relatively low skilled, and because if they're moving into the neighborhood, they have to cover for high startup costs, such as setting up a shop, such as dealing with bureaucracy. For all of these reasons, they have the incentive to keep wages as low as possible. They try to combat this with how average wages rose in many, many cities, but yeah, that's because a load of rich people suddenly moved in with good jobs and therefore who are wealthy. Like that's just not that's not relevant to these people. Yeah.
In Barcelona, Spain's fastest gentrifying area, 80% of them own homes, which means like they can continue living in better areas without being affected by any rent, or they simply sell their house for a massive profit getting out of poverty.
Not gonna lie, I don't totally buy that stat. Like 80% of homeowners in a rapidly gentrifying areas doesn't seem intuitive to me. Like the majority of times it is renters living in places owned by landlords. We think renters are the majority of the people in this place, like Baltimore, so on and so forth. That's what gentrification generally tends to look like. But second of all, on services, right? They told us that, well, you get parks, you get like better leisure facilities, you get different amenities. But first of all, we think that these superficial cosmetic benefits are just not worth it when it comes to being able to stay in your home, being able to stay in your neighborhood, and being able to pay the rent. But second of all, we think that things like school and police can actively get worse, because they told us the very demeaning idea that when you spend time with rich kids, you want to go to university and that makes your life better. Like, no, we just don't think that's the case. At the point at which your school has been flooded with people who higher income, who have access to the internet, and you don't, who have been going to good schools all their lives and you don't, you're likely to be outpaced, you're likely to not feel like your school is something that caters to your needs anymore, and you're likely to fall behind and attain worse educational outcomes. We think furthermore, a lot of the time, these benefits are limited exclusively to the areas that developers have an incentive to develop. For example, like situated within the areas of the rich people with a private school, the high fee that excludes the people that they want to help. On the idea of policing, right? We don't think that a police person, we think that the incentives that the rich people have is to defend themselves and defend their assets against low-income families, which they see as a threat to them, as opposed to protect everyone. We think that it leads to more crime, it leads to more damage. For all of these reasons, things get worse. But finally, on development, right? Because they told us that people now have no incentive to invest. First, we tell you that these areas are fine without investment, because all of the analysis rests on the idea that they're currently like terrible, they desperately need the money. But we think that if they're really so bad and so riddled with crime, one, middle class people wouldn't want to move in, and And two, developers would see that it's too far away from infrastructure to bother investing in it. It would cost too much to build a high-rise in an area with no surrounding infrastructure or facilities. But second of all, we just don't see why development must be carried out by private actors. We think that internal growth is often possible. For example, if you are a relatively low-wage, low-cost area protected by anti-gentrification laws, therefore people are going to want to come here to buy your goods because they're less expensive than elsewhere. For another, because a lot of the time people naturally become old, young children go to good schools, become more educated, become more well-off, and therefore development occurs naturally. But crucially, we told you that the private sector just isn't a good actor for carrying out development because they don't want to care for the rich. Jenna told you quite clearly that governments right now use gentrification as an excuse not to put money where it needs to go, to put it into city planning, to put it into stopping up zoning laws that really create the artificial demand that they seek to lower. For all of these reasons, we think that we protect those who are most in need of help. We're the side which better leads to development overall. Please vote Team Hong Kong.
Thank you, Government Whip, for her remarks, and call up the opposition whip to further the off case, James Arney.
Honourable judges, we in opposition have been debating benefits for three groups of people. Firstly, homeowners in gentrifying areas. The fact that 80% in Barcelona's gentrifying areas are homeowners. This statistic is also true for countries such as Romania, Bulgaria, Lithuania, and Latvia, where home ownership is very large. And even in the United States, where home ownership is very small, this is still 25%. All of these people are going to get the benefits that we are definitely talking about. The second group of people that we have been talking about are renters in gentrifying areas, the fact that you have more employment and so on, and this is something that our proposition has contested. But importantly, the third group of people that we have been talking about that hasn't really been contested are renters outside of gentrifying areas. The fact that we have more money, as we are not shoveling money into developing areas that private interests would develop anyway. The fact that we have more money to develop other poor areas in the city as well. Or the fact that both teams have an increasing demand for property, and we are allowing the supply to meet it, so that the demand doesn't start to increase rent in all poorer neighbourhoods in the city, which would have all of the negative impact of decreasing the disposable income that they're talking about. No, thank you. We are winning this debate as they only truly engage with us on the outcomes of one of these groups, the renters in gentrifying areas. Only one clash. And because we are already bringing huge economic benefits to homeowners and avoiding the harms of all the poor in the city overall, then we have already won this debate. However, the rest of my speech will start to centre around winning the only clash that they want to debate about what is going to happen to the life of renters in these gentrifying neighbourhoods. But also, before I move on to my two clashes, I want to call out an unfair line of analysis. They say that we, as the government, cannot protect the building of social housing or protecting mosques, as the private interest is too large on our side. But I think that we are both debating in a world where the government or city council has enough political capital to prevent gentrification. In this instance, we think that we will also have enough political capital to ensure social housing as well. But now, let me move on to my two clashes. Firstly, I want to talk about whether people can get jobs and whether their wages will be high enough to meet these rents. And secondly, I want to look at why these political differences won't manifest in abuses of power by incoming residents. But first off, why will people get jobs and why will the wage be high? They say that people won't get jobs because at the moment all sorts of companies rely on automation. But this is a problem under their side a lot more, as the sector which grows strongest in gentrifying areas is the service sector. People who work for the incoming businesses, clerks, cleaners, secretaries, these are the sort of jobs that we're providing. And these are the sort of jobs that also are not automated. However, what they are doing is that they are keeping these areas industrialized, industries. These are the sort of jobs that are going to be automated, and these are the sort of jobs that are going to be lost under their side, and they're not going to be bringing in employment, which is going to be prevent all of the harms they're talking about. So on our side, these incoming businesses are providing more and are providing secure jobs. But now the reason why wages will also be high enough is because of three reasons, which we've all been talking about during this debate. Firstly, because of the management chain, because there are much more opportunities for you to become like a branch branch manager or a regional manager in Marks and Spencer's than it is for you to have some sort of career in a corner shop, which means it's much more likely that people can have some sort of access to wages that are larger. But secondly, we think that they haven't really proven that rents rise as much for the cheapest households. We've been talking about the fact that density increases. When we allow development and building newer, fancier apartments, then the demand on houses and flats on the lower price side will not have such a huge demand. We think that they never proved that this happens either. The statistic that they brought up is that people in LA had to pay up to 60 more percent. Note the up to, which doesn't prove that every single person has to pay this much. We think that they also only proved that the average rent rises. They never proved that the rent rises that much for people in the lower income levels, but we did prove that the wage does rise for these people, which means that we do think that overall, people can provide the rent. But the third reason is that gentrification minimizes costs. The fact that Marks and Spencer's products are cheaper than a corner shop's products, which means that you have to pay less money for your groceries. But also, the fact that Marks and Spencer will be more likely to pay into your pension scheme, more likely to provide you healthcare and dental benefits, which all are going to minimize life costs and are going to be more likely under our side than under their side, where the sort of companies or businesses that people are working for are corner shops. Before I move on to my second clash, yes?
In gentrification, many apartment blocks are demolished for comfortable, upzone homes. Why is it that you reduce demand for housing when you actually lower the number of homes?
Well, I mean, I don't really think that's true. I don't think apartment complex is going to be demolished. The fact that what gentrification is the fact that you have lots of undeveloped places, one-story apartment flats, or like two-story apartment flats, or four-story apartment flats, which can be developed to a very large extent, which means that the overall amount of living space is going to increase under our side, which is why I live by that POI. But now moving on to my second point, where I want to talk about the reason why why there won't be an abuse of power. Three things then. Firstly, I'm going to look at the education point. Secondly, I'm going to look at why there won't be more policing, or if there is more policing, this is a good thing. And then lastly, I'm going to look at the community point. But first of all, education. They said that the problems are that, for example, there won't be schools where English is taught as a second language, or there are going to be like school orchestras which aren't good for people on the lower income side. But we think that the political capital to influence city council stays the same under both sides. That means that the numerical amount of people stays the same, whether that is the amount of people on a low income, or the amount of people from a minority group who is either ethnically or a minority in a language side. These people are going to stay the same, which means that the political capital from votes that influence the city council to ensure schools with English as a second language exists is still going to remain. We think that the worst that could happen is that the commute gets longer. The fact that some people who need a second language school may have to live a bit further away. But first of all, this is a nuisance, not a problem influencing the standard of living. We think that this isn't something that's going to influence life, right? Then secondly, many students already have to commute to schools. We think there is no reason why we should have to prioritize children in gentrifying areas to minimize their commute to schools that maybe they need to go to. But note that for most students, education will get better. As resources increase for overall schools, and the overall tax that people pay is also going to increase, which means that the overall schools that most students are going to get, not the sort of singular examples that they point out are true. We think that for most students, education is going to get better. Secondly, about more policing. We think that more policing actually just means more security. The fact that the increase in arrests that they're talking about means that there have been more police, more people more like police people who are decreasing crime, who are providing more security. We think this is surely in the interest of the majority to have more arrests, because this is going to increase security. And we think that second speaker also said that these areas are close to wealthy areas anyway, which means if proposition's analysis is true, that policing is going to be worse and racial discrimination is very bad, then this also exists under their side as well. If gentrifying areas or low-income areas are very close to wealthy areas, then we think this political capital will still exist for the policing to also be very extreme in these areas and neighbourhoods as well, which means we don't think this analysis is existing on both sides. But lastly, the community point, the fact that people need respect and need to have access to mosques. This is again, I think, a problem of commuting. The fact that if the amount of people of a certain religion stays the same, then the importance of a mosque in the city will also stay the same, and it will also still exist. We think that moreover, our extension ensures greater respect between different social groups, which ensures that there's going to be more likely that people of minorities are going to be able to live much better lives. And we think that as well, we have proved that the abuse that that the abuse is actually non-existent in these communities, which means that we think that the image or invasion is does also not exist, and therefore we think there is much more likely that under our side, integration is better and overall social relationships are better. For all of these reasons, please vote for all. Thank you.
Not gonna lie, but I don't think that the proposition speaker can simply say that they don't believe that people own houses in Barcelona because she doesn't believe that. I think that this is a statistic that they have to engage with and have to say where the fact that these people would be vastly benefited by gentrification is not reason enough to prevent it in everywhere, which is the burden the proposition faces in this debate. This means that they haven't actually shown you what we need to prevent gentrification everywhere, where no one will ever be benefited by it, or maybe even where some people might be benefited to such a great extent that we shouldn't get rid of gentrification at all. Three things that I want to talk about. Firstly, what does gentrification actually look like? Secondly, I want to look at the point of displacement, whether this is actually true, and thirdly, I want to look at this idea of community. Starting with what does gentrification actually look like? Two major things that we need to note. Firstly, we've constantly been describing gentrification as something that increases density. It's not so much people moving out, but rather more people moving in. The fact that we can develop these impoverished areas simply because development hasn't happened in those places. There are empty lots, there are broken down houses that people don't have the funds to fix. The fact that we can develop these areas into being more high-rise or simply housing more people. This doesn't inherently mean that the poor people need to move out, but simply that upper-class people can move in. This also deals with the point of rent, as our first speaker pointed out, and they haven't ever understood this point clearly. The fact that they tell you about average rent increase is quite obviously true, and we can see this, because there is more middle-class or upper-class housing than there was before. This doesn't, however, tell you why the cheapest housing must get more expensive, because they quite obviously tell you that these people who are moving in don't want to live in those places, therefore cheap housing will probably stay at the same price. But the second point of framing is what do these areas actually look like? Because they say that these areas are fine. We have refuted this claim and they haven't actually responded to the things that we say. We've said that middle-class people move in there because it's close to the centre, and that their own examples contradict the fact they say that middle-class people are afraid of those places, because they still would be, but still are in those areas, as their own examples point out. But moreover, if this actually is true, that we told you that this incentive only exists for developers and landlords in the status quo and would never exist under their side anymore, we also told you that these people probably are incapable of actually going through with some of the impacts that gentrification has on them. Therefore, I think the proposal hasn't really dealt with this point and hasn't told you why gentrification is so bad, and we've been able to characterize gentrification as a process that these people can handle, and even if they can't handle, then the alternative would always be worse for them, because then the areas would never look better than they will under gentrification. We already win this point simply based on characterization, therefore win this debate. But now the idea of displacement. Proposition simply says that these people can't get jobs because they're unqualified. That sounds extremely elitist to me. Saying that poor people can't work in a Starbucks because they are too unqualified for that, I simply don't think that's true. But moreover, they need to know that Starbucks gives these people better opportunities than working at a home cafe that you have fewer customers, simply because of the reason that less people in your area have enough purchase power to buy a cup of coffee rather than make it at home. These people are always going to be benefited by people with better purchasing power moving into those areas, wanting more service jobs, and these people being able to do these service jobs. The average rent obviously would increase on the both sides. They say that the average income obviously would increase because more people are earning a higher rent, higher wages. Note that the example they used this rebuttal against was about people in social housing. The fact that people in social housing start making $3,000 more probably isn't affected by the fact that richer people are also living in those areas, because I assume that these people wouldn't be living in social housing. Even if rent increases, then we've told you that rent increases for different housing and people would still be able to afford that rent. But notice moreover that rent increases everywhere, and this is the point where they never refute our arguments. We've told you that it's still more beneficial if people move out, because our second argument proves that we can fix roads and build better schools in those areas, because now the state has more funds left over, because developers are dealing with the other issues in areas where gentrification is taking place. They always have less funds and therefore can help these people less, even if they are forced to displace due to rent. But moreover, rent is rising everywhere because we have limited supply. They never increase supply, and therefore all of the poor people living outside of gentrifying areas are going to be living worse lives because they have to pay more rent due to the fact that there isn't more supply in their area. They are harming the people they want to help the most for these reasons.
Panel. The problem with Team Estonia's case is this. They displaced themselves out of the debate when they didn't realize that we accepted majority of their superficial benefits, like increased police presence, increased funding towards schools, but they failed to make the link that these benefits will go towards the original residents that both teams want to help. Two main questions inside of this debate. One, do these residents actually stay? Because if they don't, their entire case about benefits going towards them doesn't stand. Secondly, even if they do stay, do benefits actually accrue? On the first, I've given you multiple substantive reasons all the way since my first speech why cost of living rises. The fact that landlords have a larger profit incentive to price gouge, which we got no response from their side. Secondly, the fact that Starbucks now has a larger profit incentive to cater towards the higher purchasing power of richer residents inside of these regions, showing why Marks & Spencer's, sure, does have an incentive to charge higher prices for goods and services. Thirdly, I've shown you why there is now a larger profit incentive for developers to renovate old flats into luxury apartments, showing you why all of their analysis about old residential flats, staying old residential flats to house the original residents doesn't stand. What responses did we get? We got the idea that for some reason, because there's now more space inside of a neighborhood when a 30-foot skyscraper was built, because it can house more people, because supplies increase, the price won't increase. The problem with all of their rebuttal is they fail to respond towards the core of our analysis. It's incentives. There is a profit incentive now, which doesn't exist once we actively prevent gentrification to continue to charge higher prices. The 30-floor skyscraper, sure, even if it can house more people, developers will still try to charge as high as possible and force original residents out. Sure, even if you could potentially renovate old flats, you won't because you can earn more money selling luxury condominiums. In terms of jobs, they never realized that we accepted the fact that people can get employed at Marks & Spencer's. Sure, maybe you can get a promotion from a junior barista to a senior barista. The issue is this, because they haven't tackled incentives, they haven't shown why these people won't eventually get priced out. They managed to fail original residents, so they try to succeed on homeowners. The issue with their falsified 80% statistic is we are fine with homeowners making slightly less money under our side when we impose things like taxes on property, taxes on land. The duty of the government, which I've told you since my first speech, was to protect the most number of people from the most egregious of harms. All of the harms I've given you all the way since my P1, all of the harms they haven't responded to. We were willing to trade off homeowners since the beginning, something they never even realized when they tried to bring it back up again inside of Opposition 3. Secondly, if these people stay, do they actually benefit? Notice how we also accepted the superficial benefits as I talked about. Maybe there is higher police presence. Maybe, in general, there is a higher amount of funding towards schools. Notice the bulk of my analysis. Higher police presence doesn't mean people feel safer when police is used to be weaponized and turns against original residents when they are unjustly criminalized and unjustly charged. There may be higher funding, but when funding goes towards selective schools, when funding goes towards, sure, like maybe orchestra can slightly benefit original residents, but the fact that internet tasks which original residents can't complete are now increased, original residents' educational outcomes get far worse. Even if these people attempt to stay, they get worse off. What was the counterfactual Jenna and I tried to propose inside of our substantive speeches? What was the impact of Jenna's argument? Their entire case was premised on the idea that investment was needed inside of these regions, so they wanted to increase investment through gentrification. Jenna's argument was this: because governments actively use gentrification as an excuse to scapegoat original residents and become negligent, the impact of our argument was, the instant we actively prevent gentrification, governments are going to be accountable, governments are forced to invest in the way that both sides eventually want. The success stories I've given you all the way since my first speech. Chinatown eventually having the chance to open up. Chinatown and Little Portugal eventually having the integration their side pays can only happen when you allow original residents to decide these things for themselves rather than open up their neighborhoods forcibly like a clown. I've never been prouder to propose.